And then I looked a little bit deeper into malaria, and what really struck me was that the thing that really struck me first of all was that the equivalent of 7 jumbo jets full of children under 5 were dying from malaria every day. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that's slaughter.
G'day folks, and welcome back to Giving What We Can, where we explore how to use our resources to do the most good. Today I'm joined by Rob Mather from the Against Malaria Foundation, where he's the CEO and founder of the organisation. But before we jump in, I'm actually joined by my colleague Grace, who we're going to talk a little bit about what struck us for the episode, just to prime you for it. So Grace, what are some of the things that really struck you in this interview with Rob?
Well, one of the things that struck me is just how engaging Rob is to listen to, and also just the story of how he came to found the organisation. I think it's an incredible story that takes you from, like this very personal kind of cause through to this really big global cause that is trying to prevent malaria.
Another thing that I just loved was the stories of how he was solving problems. So like his 20-minute exercise where he thinks about what could he do with 20 minutes that could just be incredibly high leverage. The way he managed to get so many things completely free from people and organizations who he was able to bring on board with the mission of what they were working on.
It's amazing how many people he just called up and managed to convince to get on board. I think he is kind of like the ultimate salesman for good. It's such an impressive skill, and I think it's translated into such incredible impact as well.
And when we talk about the problem of malaria, the thing that really emotionally hit me was the image that he painted of 7 jumbo jets colliding on a runway each day to represent the number of children under 5 dying from malaria every day. And it's just sometimes really hard to keep in mind just that immense scale. The other thing that was quite delightful was actually hearing how the story started so far away from where it ended. So I won't spoil it for the listeners, but the way that he started from being on the couch with a television remote, changed the channel, and this series of events led from something that was quite local to him to something that was very, very international. Well, without further ado, here's Rob. Rob, welcome, and thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure. Thanks, Luke.
I'd love it if you could just start by giving a quick overview on what it is that AMF does.
Sure. So we receive funds, we buy long-lasting insecticidal nets, and we work with partners in countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, to distribute them, to make sure people in malarious areas are protected when they sleep at night from the bites of malaria-carrying mosquitoes that would otherwise cause severe illness or worse.
I'd love to hear a bit about AMF's backstory, so how it came into existence. There's quite a story there, and I really enjoy hearing it from you.
Well, you're very kind. Well, I suppose I'm not very good with the remote control of a television. That's really how my time and how I spend it changed back in 2003. So quite a few years ago now. I was watching the BBC News here in the UK, and I was looking to turn off the television and managed instead to change channels. And that turns out to have been a pretty pivotal moment, because what I then saw on the television screen was the image of a small girl, a 5-year-old girl, who had been very, very badly burned in a house fire. In fact, she'd lost 90% of the skin on her body. The only skin that was left on her body when she was burned aged 2 was the bit beneath her wet nappy because it was wet. And so a terrible accident that left a little girl called Terri in a very bad way. And one of our television channels over here ran a documentary for an hour that followed the next 3 years of her life. And she had 16 or 17 operations over the next 3 years, and it was an exceptionally moving story, an exceptionally moving piece of television. I'm not ashamed to say that I was sort of streaming for an hour watching it. My wife and I had 2 young children at the time, so perhaps there was an even more resonance there. But it was quite a story to see. And I called a couple of friends of mine after the program and said, would you swim a distance equivalent to the English Channel in a swimming pool with me, because I'm not brave enough or fit enough to do the real thing, and let's raise some money for a little girl called Terri who needs help. And my 2 friends said yes straight away, and that was back in June 2003. and our plan was to swim 22 miles, the distance of the channels between England and France, in December, so in 6 months' time. And it all then took off in a rather bizarre way when I look back, in that within 7 weeks we had 70 countries involved. We had 150 swims with people in very far-flung places. So we had people swimming in Beijing, in La Paz, Bolivia, in Vanuatu, in Fiji, in California, in Adelaide, in Turkmenistan. I mean, it was bizarre how people responded to a few emails I sent and said, yep, we'll get involved. We'd like to do a swim and be involved in what became known as Swim for Terri. And the reason it all started was that I was speaking to my brother-in-law quite by accident, and we were talking about swimming for again, a slightly bizarre reason. And I said, Peter, would you do a swim in Sydney? Would you swim the English Channel in a swimming pool off Bondi Beach, or in the iceberg swimming pool in Sydney, for a little girl who suffered 90% burns in a house fire? And he said, well, of course I would. When are we doing it? And I then decided that with a swim in London with my two friends and a swim in Sydney, in a sense of the antipodal points, not quite, but I thought, I wonder if I could make half a dozen calls and see if we could get half a dozen other people involved in something. And we could say, I think my phrase to my wife was, we can say we're ringing the world with swims for this child, because it doesn't matter where you are. A 2-year-old, 3, 4, 5-year-old that's been affected in this way, that's worth helping out. And so my first act, if you like, was to type in swimming New York into a famous search engine, and up came a name. And more interesting for me was a number. I just wanted a number. I just wanted to call somebody and speak to somebody, because I often think that's the best way of asking for assistance or taking the next step. And I phoned a lovely man called Steve Nelson. I'd never spoken to him before. And he happened to be part of a master's swimming club. So I thought, he's going to know something about swimming. And I called him up and said, hello, Steve, my name's Rob Mather. We've never spoken before. Daftest question you're going to get all week, but who the flipping heck do I talk to in your city who'd be willing to round up a group of people and on this day swim this distance for this girl who suffered 90% burns in a house fire? And his response was the same response I had when I called people called a nice man called Brian Stack in California. I called somebody in Beijing. I called somebody in, where else? Abu Dhabi, Rome, Paris. There were 8 locations in total. Singapore, I think, was in there as well. And this was people I'd never spoken to in my life before. I just found somebody who I thought might be connected with swimming. And the response that Steve gave me when I asked, who do I find in your city? He said, me. And I said, would you? And he said, of course I would. How can I not do something for a child who suffered 90% burns in a house fire? So within about 35 minutes of telephone calls spread over 36 hours, we had 8 swims involved around the world, or being planned, if you like. And there were no requirements. I said, look, it might be just you. It might be you and a few friends. If it's your swimming club, then that's terrific. And the idea is to raise some money. And I added that the 2 things you should be aware of is that please don't send me any money. This girl, Terri's trust fund, does exist. Please go and find the details, or I'll send you the details. And the money goes directly to them. And you can check them out. I mean, they are, they're for real. You can independently verify they exist. And I suppose I also said, this is genuine, because which idiot would, phone you up and ask you to do something like this? It is verifiable. You can look up Terri's story and find out about her. And so 8 swims, if you like, were within 36 hours were on the cards. And as I mentioned, over a period of weeks, it developed into many, many swims, 150 swims, 75 countries, 10,000 people. And we raised a lot of money for Terri, and 100% of it went to her trust fund. And that last bit, and indeed all of this, was seminal, if you like, was very influential on what I then came around to when I focused on malaria. So a lot of this Swim for Terri was incredibly formative. I didn't want any of the money that any of us gave to go to anything other than Terri's trust fund. So when I phoned the television company and said, would you be willing to send me some copies of the program, because we're going to raise some money for Terri, and it would be really helpful if the people involved could see the program. And a lot of these people are in very different parts of the world. It's not going to be broadcast elsewhere, but just I'd like to send a videotape, as it was back in those days, or even a DVD. And so ITV very kindly sent me the beta tape, which is a big oversized tape, and that arrived at my home. And I then thought, right, well, what do I do with this? So found somebody again, quick search. Video duplication London was what I typed into an internet search, and a nice man called Phil answered the phone. I did call the company at 6 o'clock at night, because I thought the more senior people are liable to be around then. So if I want to ask for something, pro bono, if you like, I'm more likely to have a better chance if I'm speaking to somebody who could make that decision. And this nice chap called Phil Stringer picked up the phone. And I said, daftest question you're going to get a week, Phil. This is who I am. This is what I'm doing. This is the help I'm looking for. Who do I talk to in your industry? And you won't be surprised to hear that his answer was me. So I sent him the beta tape. He produced hundreds of copies. And then another colleague in another part of the industry, if you like, of his, produced hundreds of copies of DVDs. So we sent the videotapes and the DVDs to various people all over the world, and said, please, look at Terri's story, so not so much what, but who you're swimming for. And so people were very engaged. I mean, it wasn't something that was distant, even though the person they were swimming and going to be helping was distant. It was a very personal, real, engaged, story. And I think that was very important, this connection, that people know what they're doing something for. We put a little website together, and we put dots on maps so that people involved could see who else was involved around the world. I like the idea of connecting everybody, and so we could all see that, whilst we might live in one city, there were people in many other cities spread across the planet who are all doing something together on the same day. I think that has a really nice resonance of we're all helping. One of the people involved in Australia was a lovely man called Walter Cole, whose family had association with swimming. His father had set up, I believe, the Cole Classic, which is a very famous open water swim off Bondi Beach. Yeah. And Walter said, what are we doing next year? And I said, well, it's only July. We haven't done the Swim for Terri, which is in December yet. But I don't know, maybe we'll get 1 million people swimming next year. And he said, terrific. That means we only need 999,998 more people, because I'm in. And clearly he was expressing his desire, his support, his interest. And it set something off in my brain, which I logged away, which is, I wonder if we could get a very large number of people to do something one day for something important. Anyway, Swim for Terri took place. We raised a lot of money. I learned a lot from it. Most of all, how brilliant people are, how people want to help, how generous they are with their time. There were numerous people who helped along the way. So when I was sending out the aforementioned videos and DVDs all over the world, I do know how much it cost, or I remember how much it cost to send a DVD to Nepal, which is a long way away, because we had a group swimming in Nepal for a little girl who lived 40 miles north of London, who'd suffered very badly in a house fire. And, the sort of humanity and spirit of that was was terrific. And I remember saying to Phil, the man you'll remember, who was really helpful in producing copies of the beta tape that the television company had sent me, I remember saying to him, I need to find a postage ferry here, because this is actually costing me quite a lot of money personally, sort of into the thousands of pounds at this point, which I was very happy to pay for, because I didn't want it to come out of any money that people raised. So there was an important principle there of retaining that sort of simplicity and purity of, if you raise money for Terri, all of it goes for Terri. Nothing comes off the top. Really important principle for me. And I think Phil went on holiday, a couple of weeks later with somebody I'd never met. And he sent me a short email when he came back, postage ferry found. And he had spoken to his mate, a man called Andy, when he'd been on holiday. And he subsequently became, with me, we were the first two trustees of World Swim Against Malaria Foundation Limited, I think was the name of the charity when we first set it up. So this chap, Andy, appeared and said, listen, I want to support this. This sounds like a really good thing to do. And he sent me a check for £5,000, more than I needed, totally unsolicited, never met the guy. So again, another element here of people I'd never come across wanting to help. And, I hadn't sat in a room and put together a business plan and persuaded them of something. I hadn't even met them, haven't even spoken to them. And so I was learning all the time through this experience when it came to the sort of charity fundraising thing, something I'd never really done before. And I was learning and reflecting on, the experiences I was having, if you like. So Swim for Terri finished, and Walter's comment to me and some other thoughts, other comments other people had made, but particularly Walter's comment sort of, stuck there just because the simplicity with which he sort of expressed support and enthusiasm. And having traveled in Africa and Asia and, parts of the world when I was younger, backpacking, I'd seen a lot of, disease and illness, and I'm, I suppose relatively tuned into the things that afflict very, very badly and in a very fundamental way, parts of our planet. And I suppose there was a very simple choice initially, which was not for a developed world disease, not for heart disease or cancer, because I think, relatively speaking, they get a lot of support. But there are many areas of the world that are relatively neglected, where a relatively small amount of money goes a long way. So the list that I came up with, I think, was HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, landmines, fresh water, diarrhea. Areas where, the attention, back in 2005, there was relatively, again, I'm using the word relatively quite a lot here, relatively little attention paid to some of these things. And I went through each of those, and HIV/AIDS, it's also a first world, developed world problem. So again, was getting more money than in other areas. TB, scratched beneath the surface of that, did a bit of research, quite a difficult one to work out exactly what the right intervention would be, or in a way that, with my sort of trying to sort of put myself in the position of the public and what would the public want to support. And I thought that could be quite complicated. Fresh water, massive problem, difficult. Landmines, political. And then I looked a little bit deeper into malaria. And what really struck me was that the thing that really struck me, first of all, was that the equivalent of 7 jumbo jets full of children under 5 were dying from malaria every day.
Yeah.
And if we walked down to the end of a runway and we saw, a horrific, image to put into your head, but 2 747s collide on the runway and, big fireball. And then we saw that another 3 and a bit times. And then I said, same time tomorrow, same time the next day, same time the next day. I don't think it's hyperbole to say that's slaughter. I mean, it's and that's just the under 5s. And in looking at the main mechanisms of preventing and treating malaria, quite quickly, that what we're looking at is a humble bed net that in those days cost $5. And if you put that over a head and a bed, then because mosquitoes malaria-carrying mosquitoes typically bite between 10 o'clock at night and 2 o'clock in the morning, you do a huge amount to stop the transmission of malaria. In fact, it is the most significant, it's the most effective way of preventing malaria. And even when these nets have holes and rips and tears in them, which inevitably happens in some of the environments, many of the environments in which these nets are distributed, we're not talking about houses with brick walls, we're talking about households. Because the mosquito doesn't do an aerobatics maneuver through a hole, it lands on the net and migrates to the hole. It picks up the insecticide by its feet, and that causes knockdown, literally knocks the mosquito down and kills it. So incredibly effective mechanism. And I did a bit more research, and I found that the number of nets that were being distributed was in the low millions, and the number of people that were affected was in the high hundreds of millions. And so I thought, gap. Not enough going on here, and then you run some numbers and you realize that, this is, it's not expensive to do this work. And I did feel that if I were to embark upon a process of trying to get a lot of people to swim, if the ask, if you like, or the invitation to the public was, if we swim and raise money, and we can put 100% of it, very important to me right from the start, into buying nets. So 100% of the money you give us with your donation will buy nets. We can go a long way to protect, a few $1,000s protects an entire village. So that was the sort of thinking behind the movement from, the adventure we had with Swim for Terri to, could we do a World Swim Against Malaria, or World Swim for Malaria, I think we called it initially. So that got me to thinking about the starting line, because of course now the work starts. How do you get 1 million people to swim? So, I can go on and tell you about that if you like.
It'd be great. Tell us about how you get 1 million people swimming.
So the challenge I was faced with, that I'd presented to myself, was how do I get 1 million people to swim? And I often have a 20-minute approach to getting things done, by which I mean I set myself the constraint of, once I'm going to start to do something and try and achieve something, I've only got 20 minutes to do it. So the clock starts ticking, the stopwatch goes. I can do as much research as I like, and so on. But then once I sort of, get on with it, then I've got 20 minutes. And obviously there's a certain amount of poetic license that needs to be given here, because it's really trying to help me orient towards those actions, those conversations that are key, that are going to get to the end point, either, the scale of something. So, for example, if I was trying to get 1 million people to swim and I spent, a few hours talking to and explaining what I was trying to do to a local school, well, I'd blown my 20 minutes. But also to get to that might involve 100, 200 people swimming, if the entire school was involved, let's say, and that's not scalable. And that would take a long time to get to a 1 million people swimming. So my thinking was around, I wonder if I could identify 20 organizations that I could call, spend a minute on the phone with each, and have them agree to give me, it's the wrong phrase, but to come up with 5,000 people swimming. So I took a blank sheet of paper and I wrote down organizations that I thought might be candidates for, being able to do that. And the first name on the list was the British Army. The next name was Aussie Masters Swimming, then USA Triathlon, the New Zealand Secondary Schools Sports Council, wonderful group, who had been involved in Swim for Terri. So I'd made some contacts through Swim for Terri, and it had helped me with some thinking. Modern Pentathlon. A whole series of groups included on those groups eventually was the BBC, Microsoft, organizations that per se didn't have any connection with swimming, but might have the right number of people and maybe might have an approach that would say, look, we like the idea of that. Given we're big enough, we might be able to get involved. And so always in these circumstances of getting something done, I found, is the first call is, putting the first building block of those 20, if you like, in place is really important, because it means that you can tell that story to the second person, and somebody's already agreed to support you or help you, and in a sense that either provides some sort of comfort or de-risks the second decision, and so on, the third decision, the fourth decision. So I've worked out where the head of physical training in the British Army was located, a place called Aldershot, that's about 30 miles south of London, and I called them up. And calling is, quicker than traveling, by orders of magnitude plural. So I called them up and I said, hello, can I speak to your head of physical training, please? And could you tell me who that is? And they said, that's Colonel Ted Martin, sir. And I said, terrific. Could you put me through to Colonel Ted Martin, please? And they said, yes, sir. So I was put through, and Colonel Martin's adjutant, his assistant, picked up the phone, and I said, oh, hello, can I speak to Ted, please? And that was a very specific ploy, in that I thought, this person might think I know Ted, and I might have a greater chance of being put through, because he doesn't know me at all. And I'm nobody to him, and he's head of physical training in the British Army. He's got quite a big job. Anyway, I was put through, and you'll be pleased to hear that when Colonel Martin answered the phone, I addressed him as Colonel Martin, as was appropriate and polite. And of course, you have, 5 seconds or 10 seconds, perhaps within which period of time he's going to make a decision as to whether he's going to talk to you anymore or not. And that buys you another 45 seconds if you get through that hurdle, and then it buys you another couple of minutes. And so my 5 or 10 seconds to Colonel Martin was, Colonel Martin, my name's Rob. We've never spoken before, but I'm going to try and get 1 million people to swim to help stop 7 jumbo jets full of under 5s dying from malaria every day. Could I speak to you about that? Go on. And it gave me 45 seconds. Anyway, he said, look, I've never spoken to a civilian for 45 minutes on the phone, for 44 minutes. I remember the number, 44 minutes on the phone before. Get your backside down to Aldershot, come and see me. And so I went to see Colonel Martin, and I explained in a meeting with him what I was looking to do, which was to get 1 million people to swim. And we talked about his physical training instructors, and I said, look, I suppose really my request, Colonel Martin, is, or Ted, we were, I think, Ted and Rob at that stage. I said, what I'm really looking for, Ted, is would you send emails to your 350 physical training instructors and ask them if they'll organize a swim? And if 50 of them do, and wives and husbands and girlfriends and boyfriends and the chefs on the base and the children and the teachers at the school, etc., if 100 people said yes, they'll swim, in any way they wanted to, then that's 5,000 people. Or if you got 100 people to say yes and 50 people at each swim on average. And he said, why would I send an email? And that was the moment at which I have to say the world did slightly stand still for me, because I thought, aha, this man is really quite busy. And I've turned up with my little charity idea. And he's just about to say, I really am, quite busy with lots of things, in my day job. I'm sorry, but that's not something that, we can get involved in. Instead, what he said was, why would I send an email to my 350 direct reports and ask them to do something? I'll just bloody tell them. Excuse the language. In other words, he got it. And he just said, look, we can help with this. What a terrific thing to do. And I then spoke to Aussie Masters Swimming from the UK, and managed to get through to somebody who got it, and it was instant, I have to say. I mean, it was not quite a minute on the phone with each, but I mean, many of these calls were not long, and people said, look, this is terrific, we're in. And strategically, I waited until I had 12 organizations involved. So in essence, indications, if I can put it that way, not so much promises or commitments, of 60,000 people involved. And then I called a very nice man called Simon Ryder, and he was president of Speedo. Because I felt that if I went to see Simon at that point and said, I've got 60,000 people lined up to swim, that will be the world's largest participatory swim ever. Could we get you involved? And Speedo could get 5,000 people involved. So I went to see him, and he said, swimming, global, terrific course, no-brainer. I think he might have said, how much money do you want? And I said, don't want any money. Just want 5,000 people to swim like everybody else. And what I was aware of is that if we had Speedo agreeing to become involved, and I did have some comments to make about, sort of the commercial side of this, that this wasn't about, commercial stuff. It was about doing something, humanitarian with lots of different groups involved, and let's involve everybody, as best we can. What I was aware of is that, given that Speedo, were then and arguably are now, I believe, the dominant, swimming brand, and they certainly were the sponsors of, a huge proportion of the world's Olympic gold medalist swimmers, and the like, that would be an interesting element to introduce, because if we could have well-known swimmers standing up and saying, if I take part in World Swim Against Malaria and I swim, I count as one person. It doesn't matter how fast I swim. And if you swim, you count as one person as well. The sort of sentiment I was trying to surround World Swim with was that we're all equal. We're all in this together, helping, fellow human beings. It's not about celebrity. It's not about, I'm better than you, I'm faster than you. And the response from those swimmers, by the way, was absolutely terrific. I mean, they were brilliant. They really put themselves out. They wanted to help. They didn't want to be in it for profile. They just thought this is the right thing to do. So that's back in 2004. During 2004, I was having these conversations and put together 20 groups during that period who would agree to, and follow-up conversations, who agreed to take part, set up a charity with the help of some other organizations, all pro bono, which is another side to this story, I guess. And the World Swim was launched and took place in December 2005. So that's a flavor of how it all started and where it came from. Initially, me not being very good with the remote control of the television.
I have a couple of follow-ups to that. How did you find the transition moving from a single identifiable person that needed help to working on malaria, which is one of the biggest diseases in the world, which impacts millions, hundreds of millions?
Good question. I'm not sure I've ever thought about that before. I think the thing that's similar between the two is that we all knew what we were doing, the thing we were doing for. In the case of Terri, it was helping Terri. In the case of malaria, it was stopping people dying and falling sick. So whilst you're obviously correct to point out that it's an individual to many individuals, so an amorphous group, if you like. So I don't think there was never a moment when I thought about, this is a change or a step up, or that didn't occur to me. It was more, I suppose, focusing in the first case with Terri and trying to support her. It was a slightly random walk of let's get some swims involved, and if we can push it along a bit and get more people involved, that's better. And then I really liked the idea of some of the sort of slightly wild and wacky things we did with Swim for Terri. For example, some students at two of the universities in the UK wanted to help, and they said, we'd like to do something really different because it can be part of a sort of fundraising activity here, and if it's really different, then we can generate more interest. And so I decided it would be a really good idea to fly them out to an island in the middle of the Atlantic, Ascension Island. There's slightly more backstory, but in the interest of time. And so 8 students said, yeah, we're up for that. So I said, well, look, if I can make it work, it's, you'd be on a 9-hour flight to an island in the middle of nowhere. We do have a swim for Terri on Ascension Island, and you could take part in it and then come back again. So you could say that you're going to swim the English Channel in the middle of the Atlantic to raise money for a child with 90% burns. And they became very excited about that. And so I called the base commander, the Royal Air Force base commander in Ascension Island, and said, I've got some people that would really like to come and join your swim. And I think I was aware at the time that this particular individual knew of the swim that was taking place, I think, in the only swimming pool that existed on this very small dot in the middle of the Atlantic. And he liked the idea and said, look, clearly we're the Royal Air Force, and so, we're a part of Her Majesty's Armed Forces. We have a job to do. And by the way, I have no connection with the Army or the Air Force, although because I'm indicating I have, far from it. But there's a flight that goes down from a airfield called Brize Norton, and what we concocted together is that he said it would be. There was some connection between some of the students and also the cadet forces. I think I'd put that piece together as well at the universities, and so there was there were some elements we could draw together here. It wasn't sort of totally random, but there were some pieces we stitched together. And so these students had to be at Brize Norton at 2300 hours when the plane took off. They then flew for 9 hours, were dropped off, spent time involved in swimming the English Channel in a swimming pool as part of a group. The aeroplane then, by the way, flew onto the Falkland Islands off South America, turned around, flew back to Ascension Island, picked them up, flew them back to London, or the UK. And therefore, over a period of, I don't know what the elapsed time was, 22 hours, these 8 people had flown to the middle of the Atlantic, swum the English Channel, come back. and there were a number of stories like that as part of Swim for Terri that were, in a sense, creating stories, creating experiences. We didn't have any marketing. We didn't spend any money on marketing Swim for Terri. It wasn't about that. It was a very organic, just us ordinary folks doing something. So I suppose the same sort of thing was taken forward with World Swim. Yes, we're now focusing on millions of people in terms of the, those we're trying to support. But the thing that was retained was the ordinariness of what we were doing, yet the sort of slightly wacky story part of what we were doing. Definitely what was not wacky was the fact that 100% of the money we raise will buy long-lasting insecticidal nets. They'll end up over heads and beds, and we'll prove it. So there was a very simple, we swim, we save lives. There were a number of sort of taglines we used. Again, we didn't pay for any marketing. It was very helpful having Speedo and other swimming organizations involved. So Tier and Arena and Zogs and other people. So again, no commercial pitching here really, but more just people with, the chairman of Speedo has a very big heart and is a wonderful man. And he said, look, we're behind this. This is the right thing to do. So I think we engaged a lot of people in just cooperating, had the right sort of sense around it. So, that's changed from one person to, an important problematic disease. Never really came up as something we had to think about.
And speaking of the swims, how has your fundraising changed since the early days of World Swims to now where Against Malaria Foundation is now? I imagine it's quite different, but there may be some threads that have maintained the whole way through.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. We don't focus on the swim now. We did a World Swim, as we called it, World Swim Against Malaria, WSM. That took place in 2005 and then 2008 and 2010. There were requests to do it again, and so we did, and then we did it again. And it did require, quite a bit of focus of my time to sort of move things along, albeit with the swims, we didn't organize anything. We had no overheads. And indeed, those early days of World Swim, and indeed for the first 10 years of the Against Malaria Foundation's, as we subsequently became known, organization, we were just 2 people. So me and my colleague Andrew. And Andrew and I had worked together sort of previously. He was the head of technology of a business I ran. So we found that a lot of people just wanted to give us money. So I remember somebody writing to me and saying, I'm a poet and I can't swim. I actually cannot swim. And so I can't raise money for you that way, but I think the line was, I can swim in words. And is that any good to you? And, some lovely conversations like that with people who really wants to help. And World Swim Against Malaria, if you're obviously going to drop the swim bit, you're left with 2 fundamental words, against malaria, which really, tells you what it's all about. And so not only did the website, change to againstmalaria.com, but we in essence invited people to fundraise in whichever way they wished to, as long as it was safe and legal, set up a fundraising page on the Against Malaria website. Have people
I've set up a few of my own over the years.
Well, and we're very grateful, Luke, for that. And direct, funding, so that from the, again, sort of empathetically trying to put ourselves in the position of the fundraiser or the donor, from a fundraiser's perspective, it wants to be simple, easy. I don't have to collect any money. I'd like to know how much I've raised. I'd like to know where the money goes, which, distributions my individual donation has funded. It'd be really nice rather than into some big, pot. So the transition became, it just evolved because people started giving us money. We found that people who'd swum and had organized a swim or had just donated said, my family give charity, contributions each year, and we'd like to give it to you guys. Are you still accepting money? And I think part of that was assisted by us gently and appropriately communicating with donors and providing updates and information and thank yous but never soliciting funds. So we never wrote to people and said, please, can we have some more money? There's a big hole. Please, would you consider us? I felt very strongly about that if people wanted to support what we were trying to do, it was because they looked at what we were doing and the information we were providing and thought, this is a good thing. Not because we were clever at marketing or had a nice picture or an advert. And that's perhaps a personality thing. I don't like the soliciting aspect of it. I also think that it, on a very practical level, it's tough because you've either got to put money into it to advertise and market and get your message out, the whole wider sort of marketing, soliciting type approach. And that means that the percentage of people's, a percentage, potentially a significant percentage when you're small, of people's funds are going on that. And I didn't like the optic of that. I thought that was not right. So there was a very particular approach of moving the organization or allowing the organization to evolve, or this thing that was becoming Against Malaria to evolve, where people could give us money in whatever way they wanted. We'll link every piece of money you give us to a specific net distribution, because we can come up with some technology and database and code and, clever systems. That's where Andrew comes in. Very clever chap. And we can share with donors, every single donor, what you've helped to achieve. So if you've given us $10, nowadays, as we know, it's moved from $5 a net to $2 a net. So if you give us $10, we will buy 5 nets. In fact, obviously it's 5.2 nets, but we'll echo out that integer number. 5 nets, and they'll protect, 10 people or 9 people. And this is the location to which your nets will go or be distributed in. And here are the nets either in manufacture or being shipped. We can track and echo out all that information back to donors. So we moved away from the swim being a focus of what we were doing to our focus is on funding as many nets as we can and protecting as many people as we can, because that's the way we move towards the impact we want to have, which is reduce the number of deaths and reduce the number of cases of malaria. So it was a natural transition. And
of course, now you also have a lot of large institutional funding as well, and other organizations who have recognized the quality of the work that's being done and the cost effectiveness as well.
So we have two sorts of donors. I would categorize them in this way, and then we can perhaps come back to your institutional comment. We don't get any money from governments. So it's sort of new money.
Philanthropic institution.
Yes, I realized you meant that. Yes, that was a non sequitur. So we don't get any money from governments, but we have two sorts of donors. People like sort of, you and me, if I can put it that way, who give, $10 and 30 euros and 20 Swiss francs and, 40 New Zealand dollars, etc. And that's our bedrock of support. That's our lifeblood. And often when it appears on graphs, it appears in red because it's the sort of most important bit, I would argue. And there are many tens of thousands of donors each year now who give in that way. And a lot of those donations are recurring, which is, really good to see, because it typically indicates that somebody has thought about their charitable giving. And we have a very high retention rate of recurring donations, I think for a series of reasons, not least of which is donors can see where their money is, how many nets have been funded with that money, as I just explained, and where their nets are going, and they have their own personal page where they can, track, how many nets have I funded, how many people have I protected, and exactly where. And the second group of donors we have is what I refer to as the large donors. So they are people who give large donations. So in our world, it's typically north of $1 million. We draw the line there, I suppose artificially, but in 2011, we had our first donation of $1 million from a very nice Scotsman called Brian. And that was a total punch the air moment, because at that stage, whilst we were looking at probably let's say $4 a net, wasn't quite down to $2 at that point. That's 250,000 nets to protect 500,000 people, in one donation. And so that was really important. And a number of organizations and individuals from 2011 onwards have subsequently given us multiple millions of dollar donations, including some of the institutions you've referred to, some of the EA organizations. So particularly, GiveWell, the Life Can Save, Giving What We Can, the three of the bigger ones there, and most influential. And their evaluation of AMF, prodding and poking at what we do, requesting the data, looking at the data, which I am all in favor of. The whole being held to account is incredibly important to me and all of us at AMF. And that led to, some very good evaluations and some very positive evaluations of what we were doing. And that led to recommendations to give us money, and money being directed to us. But I would argue that those large donations of millions of dollars only come to us because we have built an organization over, the first 7 years of AMF was $1 to $2 million a year. We were sort of bumbling along, with or without swims, with the odd biggish donation. But, sleeves rolled up, working hard to just make sure the operational elements of the nets that were just being distributed were being distributed totally accountably. We could account for them, and we could feed that information back to donors, simply report back, either in the occasional email or something more public on a website. And then after 7 years, we saw our revenues grow, through the sort of low integers up to sort of $15 million. And then they jumped up to the tens of millions of dollars. In the last couple of years, we've been in the hundreds, or we've been above 100 million. So we've, it's been a slow build, if you like, in many ways over 15 or so years, where we've wanted to explicitly take people to the best of our ability to take support with us. And, one of the things I really hope we will be able to achieve, that we will, appear in people's giving priorities, continue to be high, is that fixing malaria isn't a sort of 1 year deal. It's going to take another 10 years of hard effort with well-directed funds. Now that we're starting to increase the level of funding, there's still a huge gap in funding, I'm afraid, and we have to make nasty decisions on a regular basis and turn people down. We just don't have the money to fund your millions of nets. We just don't. And that means that twice that number of people will be unprotected when they sleep at night because nobody else has got any more money. So we hope that our gentle-ish approach to communicating with people, but the very focused way we report back and what we report back on, will continue to deliver sort of high levels of confidence in what we do, such that people feel able and willing and keen to support what we do. So there's a journey we've been on and we're still on to take support with us.
Amazing. We're going to change gears a bit and talk some of the nuts and bolts of malaria and bednets and AMF operationally. I'd love if you could talk about how you do the monitoring and evaluation, how you know if people are using bednets properly.
Household level data is the answer to all of the questions you've just asked. If we're distributing millions of nets at a time, the only way you know that they have got to the right people in the right quantities is if you have household level data. So let me paint, in a sense, the opposite picture that can occur, and arguably did occur, and sometimes does still occur, although not in the distributions that we're involved in. If you and I, Luke, were parachuted in to a health center that dealt with 100 villages, and so there might be, let's say, 20,000 people in that catchment area across 4,000 households, something like that. We could send out, or data collectors, let's call them that, so perhaps a portion of the staff from the health center could be sent out to all of the villages in turn to visit each household, understand how many people were in each household, and therefore how many nets individually each household needed to achieve universal coverage. And roughly, as I mentioned earlier, it's 2 people per net. So if there are 8 people in a household, they'll probably need 4 nets, or maybe 5, because it might be appropriate that grandma has a net on her own, and, a teenage girl has a net on her own, and the 2, younger brothers have a net on their own, etc. So, but let's say it's 2 people per net. You collect that data, and perhaps you collect that data on paper. And you've therefore got many pieces of paper that come back to the health center. And if you were to tot up all the totals across the pages and across the whole paper set, you might work out that you need 8,000 nets or 10,000 nets across that particular catchment area. Now, what used to happen, and certainly it was given the space to happen, that when you reported up the chain how many nets were needed by that health center, if the health center reported 12,000 or 13,000 or 15,000, the only way you could ever know, because we're not talking about very accurate census information existing, is if you sent somebody to that health center and had somebody tot up all the rows on each page and all the totals on each page. In other words, unfortunately, there was a gap created, and I'm not wishing to suggest that a high proportion of people would do this. In fact, it's the opposite. But you created a space there for, let's call it, inflation to occur. Now, that's not only incredibly inefficient funding-wise, because you might be providing 5,000 additional nets to a location where you don't need them to go. And those nets, by the way, and there are examples, I'm afraid, of this happening, those 5,000 nets are then squirreled away and released into pharmacies or onto the black market, and people make money from them. And rather than thinking, oh, well, at least the nets end up over heads and beds at a certain point, don't they? We're operating against a landscape here of not enough nets to go around. So it means that those 5,000 nets that should have gone somewhere else to protect 10,000 people are being held back and sort of being dripped onto the market over time. What you have got straight away is 10,000 people who are not covered, and that's very bad. So our approach fundamentally, with all of our partners, and we work with partners to do this, is that we gather household level data. These days, it's not gathered on paper. It's gathered electronically in all of our distributions using smartphones that have GPS location data collected at the same time, at the moment of collecting the household level data. And so you can already see that what we're moving to is a circumstance where we've got electronic data. So you can interrogate that in a very different way. Well, you can interrogate it in a way you can't interrogate data on paper. So that's a shift in the game straight away. And then we have a number of mechanisms that we use and they're driven and anchored solely in sort of common sense, really, as to how do we go about checking that data. So one of the things we do, because we don't tend to do trust, because we don't think trust is a good way of going about the programs we run, not through any lack of respect for the people we work with, but we just don't do trust, we do data, is we say to the 100 data collectors we have in a room, or the people we work with who will put them through an orientation and training program, showing them the household registration form, the smartphone that is used to gather the data, and there's a half-day training that's required to orient people. We will say, in effect, to those 100 data collectors gathered in a room, thank you for the work you're about to do in going to thousands of households, because it's really important that we gather accurate data so we get the right number of nets to each individual household so every sleeping space is covered. These 5 other people in the room are also data collectors, and they are going to go to 5% of the households that each of you visit in the day or days after you've collected your data, and they will have no knowledge of the data you collected, and they will go to randomly selected households. In other words, we're going to collect duplicate data for 5% of the households. In other words, the message that we are communicating to the data collectors is, please be accurate with your work, because we will be checking up on it. Not because we don't trust you, because we don't do the trust thing. We're just going to focus on collecting the data and making sure that the data is accurate. And by doing that 5% revisit work, as we call it, which is, if we think economically, is adding 5% to the cost of collecting data at 100% of the households. So it's a relatively small additional amount of money. And the collecting the data from the households is only one part of the entire universal coverage campaign costing, which includes nets, shipping, household registration, distribution, customs clear, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, it's a very small additional amount of money that's very focused on ensuring incredibly high data quality, which means that then we can have a much higher level of confidence that the nets are getting to the right people in very, very high proportions, and we're maximizing the impact we have. So that 5% revisit is the first way, and is typical of the ways we think about trying to make sure that the work we do is the work we want to have done. Other things we do are something called IVR, which is independent village re-registration. So we will select randomly a material number of villages, so it might be 40, 50, 100, and we will pay, working with completely independent organizations, we will pay for that organization to go and register every single household completely in those villages, so that we can then have another way of triangulating in on accuracy, if you like, of the data that the national health system is collecting, because it's the health system in a country that's activated to go to all of these households and collect the data. It has to be that, because you're looking at thousands, and in some cases several tens of thousands of people in a country that are activated across a period of weeks or months to go and collect the household level data. And remember, you've got to do that, because otherwise you'd have to give, I guess, two nets per household, and that's over giving for a household that's only got 2 people, and woefully under giving for a household that's got 9 people, or even 6 people. So independent village re-registration gives us data points. We don't do it in all distributions, and COVID has affected it to a degree, but it allows us another angle on checking on accountability. Some of the other things we do that are more observational, but are equally or have their place and are important, is that we do planning monitoring. So if we're funding millions of nets and putting millions, if not tens of millions of dollars worth of donors' money into funding nets into a country, then we're in a sense supporting and backing a major logistics program, a major project in a country. And one of the fundamental keys to success in that country is the leadership of the program and the key people within the National Malaria Control Program who are managing that very large project. So what we like to do is to get involved, is to make commitments a number of years ahead, because this is, again, a major logistical program with nets taking many, many months to be manufactured, shipped, and then transported in country. We pay for an independent organization to sit in meetings in country, not because we want to spy or check up on you, because this is a team effort. It's not us and them. It's the metaphorical, we're all sitting around the same circular table. We, however, wish to have a very good understanding of the planning process. What are the schedules, the resources, the personnel, because it's that planning that is at the heart of delivering a really good outcome. I mean, a really good painting a room and making it terrific is 95% preparation and 5% wielding a paintbrush. So focusing on the preparation is really important. And if we come up with things that we have concerns about or we think are, outright problems, it doesn't happen often, but, we have questions. We're raising those questions and observations or concerns in the spirit of we're all on the same side. And if we can raise them early, perhaps because we are bringing to bear experience we have in other countries with deployment of handheld devices for gathering data electronically at households, we're then a positive contributor to the team effort. So we're not trying to sit there and catch people out. In the same way, we have independent organizations that we pay for. We go through a tendering process that's very detailed, and we are very careful in our selection of partners in country. And we look at their leadership and their experience and their attitude, etc. And we will then pay tens of thousands of dollars for people to monitor the registration. Again, sampling, because you can't go to every single village being registered, obviously. But we have mechanisms for doing that, so we can do a sensible job of making sure that things are going right, and putting ourselves and our partners in a position where we can pick up if things are going wrong. So here we're getting into, if you like, the sort of the nitty-gritty of the operations, because that's where we as an organization are going to underachieve. We don't necessarily underachieve on fundraising because hey, we can only spend the money we've got. I can't put legal agreements in place so I don't have the money. The more money we have, the more of the gap we can fill, and boy, have we got a big funding gap. But where we would mess up is if nets were stolen or they got to the people in the wrong quantities and we weren't covering people. And so there's an exceptional level of effort and focus that goes into thinking about how we monitor all of the operational procedures to help improve things. Monitoring waybill movements and shipping movements, and there are a myriad other ways we do it. But that gives you a flavour of the sort of we're very much involved in the operations. We don't just agree to fund nets and then say good luck, step aside. We have a almost 40-page legal agreement with a Ministry of Health, 3/4 of which has pages that are exceptionally detailed operationally in terms of clauses, put together, I should add, in collaboration and cooperation with the National Malaria Control Program and the Ministry of Health. It's not us turning up and saying, here's our document, without any thought, this is it. I mean, there's a lot of thought and experience that goes behind it, but we do have some accountability requirements that we have to have agreed to. Otherwise, it's problematic for us to fund nets, because then we can't be sure, less attractive things are going to happen to the nets that we fund. So, there's a very specific process there that's very detailed.
I'd be really interested if you could talk about how bednets differ from some of the other malaria interventions, such as chemoprevention, the upcoming gene drives that are on the horizon, and the new vaccine on the horizon, and kind of where you see the future of this.
The solution to malaria I often think of as a jigsaw puzzle with relatively few pieces in it. Long-lasting insecticidal nets are a big piece. Artemisinin combination therapy is another big piece. ACTs, as they're known, is the drug that you can take, which over a period of 3 or 4 days, can purge the malaria parasite from your system. Rapid diagnostic testing kits are another really important part. If you present at a health center with a fever and other symptoms of malaria, it may be malaria, but it may not be. And in fact, typically it's 50-50. So it's worth testing somebody through a rapid diagnostic testing kit to indicate whether you do or do not have malaria, so that we give ACTs out to the right people and don't over or too quickly exhaust the supply, simply providing ACTs to people who don't need them. SMC, seasonal malaria chemophylaxis, I think, is a very important part of malaria control. It's one of those pieces that is a more recent entrant, if you like. And that focuses on the under 5s typically, and involves a sort of an annual dosing, if you like, if I can call it that. And that is very important in reducing malaria cases and malaria deaths. And it targets one of the very at-risk groups, the under 5s. The other at-risk group is pregnant women. And they are the most vulnerable groups because the under 5s have a developing immune system, so that is able, relatively speaking, to withstand malaria, and pregnant women find that their immune system is somewhat compromised when they're with child. So those are the two very at-risk groups. Those are our current tools, if you like. There are other very important elements of malaria control, removing areas of stagnant water where possible, because that's where malaria-carrying mosquitoes breed. So old tires. If you've ever tried to get the last bit of water out of a tire, good luck with that without a towel or a very warm day. And so, water can collect in relatively small places, teeny weeny puddles, and mosquitoes can breed. So, there's an element of sort of sanitation that is very important, that supports malaria control, back to those sort of basics, if you like. Larviciding is another thing you can do, where you effectively spray on the top of water surfaces, and in fact you can put fish in water bodies that eat the eggs of the breeding mosquitoes, but they're I suppose they're smaller in terms of their impact, very much so. So we're looking at nets and SMC and drugs and ACTs and rapid diagnostic testing kits, and arguably things like health system strengthening, so that you can diagnose malaria quickly, so that person that is infected, that could be considered to be an infected blood pool, if you like, you want to remove that infected blood pool, because then a non-malaria carrying mosquito that bites somebody, it's annoying, but because that person doesn't have, it's an itch, if you like, afterwards, it's not biting an infected person, and therefore it's not going to pick up the malaria parasite. There's no transmission involved. And so there's a great bonus in reducing the infected blood pool, because that's part of making malaria go away. So health system strengthening, HSS as we often refer to it, that receiving funding is very important too. And then on the horizon, because we don't have a silver bullet right now, is the potential of a malaria vaccine, a highly effective malaria vaccine, and the potential for gene-drive technology to give us a silver bullet. And the way I often explain where we are with both of those things is that we have a malaria vaccine, a recently approved malaria vaccine, RTS-S is its designation, I think more frequently known colloquially as Mercurix. And it's been described to me by people who know much more about this than I do, that it is a tool in the toolbox. It's helpful, but it's not a bullet, let alone a silver bullet, if I can use that rather unfortunate analogy of it's not the answer. It's not a panacea where it can be deployed and we can make rapid progress and eradicate malaria in swathes. And part of the reason for it being a contributor, a tool in the toolbox, is perhaps best understand if we think of another well-known vaccine, and that is for polio. And with polio, you had a vaccine that was effective on 100% of the population. It was 100% effective. It could be given, it only needed to be administered once, and it had no cold chain logistics. It had no tricky logistics. You could literally put a vaccine drop on a sugar lump, or indeed inject it. It was very easy logistically to get it to the people who needed it. Now you compare that with the current malaria vaccine we have in the toolbox. It's only targeted at under fives, so it's only a proportion of those people that are affected, albeit that's an important group. It's only, I believe, 30 to 35% effective, not 100%. So it's better than nothing, obviously, but it's not at I think the WHO frequently say that they look at 70 to 75% efficacy and effectiveness for vaccines they support. So it's under that threshold. It does require multiple injections 1 week apart, and then I think a booster injection after a week. And I believe there are some quite challenging logistic elements involved in its deployment. So the comparison between polio and the current malaria vaccine is that, it's not where we want it to be. I would add to that the scientists who've come up with it have been amazingly brilliant, because this is the first time we've found a vaccine for a parasite. Remember that, COVID, which we're so familiar with, is a virus, whereas malaria is a parasite. And never in the history of, man have we found a vaccine for a parasite. So that's a major development. And let's hope, in terms of its practical application, in terms of the practical application of a malaria vaccine, that other scientists or the same scientists will build on the work that, the brilliant people have done so far and the success they've had so far. And at some point in the future, we will come up with something that is, is that silver bullet, is that, hey, we can vaccinate everybody now and really, nets are totally second grade and, not sort of required anymore at a certain point in time. Unfortunately, what I'm being told by the scientists who work on malaria vaccines is that we're, at least 10 years away from that, if not longer. I'm very happy to stand corrected. I would be delighted to be corrected and that number to be lowered. And so there's progress, but we're not there yet. And in terms of, the proportions of funding that are going to go into malaria control, it's not, I don't think it's going to change dramatically. And nets and some of these other solutions we've spoken about or contributors are going to remain the mainstays of what we do. And then the other area where we have promise of a game changer is in gene drive technology. And for those who are unfamiliar with it, gene drive technology refers to driving a change in the gene through, very clever chemistry. And the way, this layman, understands it is that in the past, if you wanted to alter, base pairs or groups of base pairs in a gene sequence, it was akin to throwing a rather small grenade at the sequence, and there would be some collateral damage, and lots of testing had to go on to see what that collateral damage might be. And with the advent of two particular technologies, something called CRISPR and something called Cas9, metaphorically speaking, we're able to go in with a pair of scissors and snip out a base pair and replace it, in a sense by unzipping the gene and then zipping it back up again. It's incredibly clever. Some research that was done a number of decades ago, but in recent years was picked up and extended. And so we have an opportunity there of adjusting the gene, and there are many ways that could be done. For example, potentially you could adjust the gene in some mosquitoes such that they no longer are able to transmit malaria. It's worth pointing out that I think there are something like 4,000 species of mosquito, and we're not worried about 3,960 of them because they do not transmit malaria. They're not vectors for malaria. 40 of them are, and of those 40, 5 are particularly nasty. And so if we could adjust one of those species of mosquito that's in the very bad category, whilst there will no doubt be a debate about any sort of gene modification work on a species, I don't think it would take me very long, unless there's something I'm about to find out that would change my mind, that removing effectively or adjusting one of 4,000 species of mosquito, I would be putting both hands in the air pretty quickly, given the impact it potentially could have on malaria. I believe that sort of work is 7 to 10 years away from the sort of next major step forward of coming up with something that's a sort of practical solution. And there are various research projects going on around this area at the moment. And we, those of us in the malaria community, if you like, fingers crossed, and we fervently hope that, there will be, major progress forward in the coming years. And I like to think of it or it was described to me in one way that I thought was quite good. When I asked, where are we when it comes to finding a gene drive solution that could really impact malaria? And I was told, well, the gene drive solution to malaria is a small hut. It can be considered to be a small hut that's 2 meters by 2 meters and is camouflaged and sits beneath the Amazon rainforest somewhere in the Amazon. And up until relatively recently, or arguably up until Cas9 and CRISPR, we didn't know where that hut was, and we had no way of finding it other than hoping we might stumble across it or systematically overflying, with binoculars and looking at the Amazon rainforest. With the advent of CRISPR and Cas9, we have stumbled across, or we are now on the road that leads to that shack. We just don't know whether it's 100 kilometers down the road or 1,000 kilometers down the road, but we're on the road. In other words, it's now a matter of time. It's when, not if. And so that's a really important step forward. And I like that, we're now on the hunt for that hut or that shack in the Amazon rainforest that is the gene drive solution to malaria. Maybe a vaccine will appear first. Isn't it good to have two different technologies, scientific endeavors, seeing if we can materially help at some point in time, remove malaria?
Oh boy, very exciting. So we've just had that story of the path to near eradication, if not eradication. Suppose that malaria is effectively eradicated sometime, hopefully, in the near future. What do you see yourself doing next?
Well, lots to get on with. I often give a talk called Plan B, and Plan B for AMF is close it down. And that would be a fabulous day because, any of us working against malaria, we'd all love to be out of a job in that sense because, thousands of people don't die, millions, hundreds of thousands of people don't die, and millions don't fall sick. I've been asked to get involved in a number of other, areas of, disease and charity activity, and a number of things interest me. Probably wouldn't be prudent to go into them here. It takes too long, or I get too enthusiastic about things I'd like to be doing. But I think there are, as you know, Luke, there are plenty of areas that need work, and I would hope that some of the things we've learned over the years at AMF could be brought to bear in another area. So I don't think we'll be short of options.
And you personally, anything? If you do succeed and everything goes well, and you actually shut down malaria AMF, you should take a little holiday or something for a bit before you start the next thing.
Yeah, probably. I think my wife would agree with that, but my children. But I suppose I'm really keen to. I feel as though I've had a very privileged existence in so many ways, in my, upbringing and education, and people I've worked with and so on. And I guess I do have a pretty strong passion to try and help and make something happen and improve things. So I don't ever see sort of not doing something or wanting to help. And what's important in any project is having a really good team of people, smart people, and that is not only, those are my colleagues at AMF. I have a very good sort of family of people at AMF who, are really not only very smart people, but they're passionate about what they do. And I suppose that's a key element of any endeavor you get involved in. It's, nobody ever does anything alone. And of course it extends beyond the AMF team because we work with, partners in country and so on. So that's always a fun part of the journey because the work you do, because you come across really interesting people. And it's been, given the model at AMF has been one of, we don't pay for anything in the sense that our central costs at AMF are very low. Broadly, it's just the salaries of 7 people. We don't have any bills for accounting and banking and legal and audit and, we do have an audit fee actually at the moment, which we'd like to see go away, but that's recently appeared. Translation and web hosting and so on. So our central costs are really low. And that means, or it is because I have had conversations with hundreds and hundreds of people and said, who in your industry would agree to help us, but we don't really want to pay you because you don't need $2 more than a couple of children in Africa to be a bednet. And I've been privileged to have so many conversations with so many brilliant people who've said, yeah, we'll help. And nobody's ever stepped away in 16 years. They've, we've managed it in a particular way. So I think, again, some of those lessons, perhaps I would take forward into the next thing I do and say, it's a model that works, with the right bits in place, and hopefully, we could make I say we, because what I do next, I wouldn't do on my own. We can make a difference, in some other area. And I've got a few ideas, but I'll keep those to myself just for the moment because there's a lot of work we have to do on malaria right now.
Yeah. Before closing, is there anything else you'd like to say to our community?
Well, a big thank you. AMF is has been supported in the most fabulous way by the EA community, and the wider public. But when the EA community, if I can, call it that, appeared, some 10 or so years ago, we started seeing, a terrific level of sustained support, and that support has grown. So AMF is at the size it is at now, in no small part because of the EA community and people